Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this edition of AACRAO's Credential Chats. We are joined this episode by Ashley Finley. Ashley is the Vice President for Research and Senior Advisor to the President for the American Association of Colleges and Universities, AACNU. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure, Noah. Always.
And I really sorry, folks. We were just giggling right before we went live here, and we're apparently still going with it. But actually, for folks who aren't aware, AAC&U is a part of the LER, the Learning Employment Records Accelerator, and along with ACRAO and a lot of other professional and higher ed associations. And, maybe a starting place is just kind of to share for you, when you think about what LERs are and what this space is and why it's important, how are you kind of just conceptualizing of it?
I love that question, and I love the opportunity to reflect on why it's obvious to me why we would be engaged in that work, but it's an opportunity always to reflect and articulate why it's so important. I I have been known to describe LERs as the Trojan horse for talking about all the things we've been wanting to talk about and have been talking about in higher ed for a very long time. It ends up when you talk about learning and employment records, you've got to talk about things like learning and experiences and skills and outcomes and how we validate those things and how we, and I think very importantly, bundle learning in new and creative ways so that those qualities, those skills, those experiences, those levels of achievement are made far more transparent than they are in the transcript alone. So we have been talking about all those things for a very long time, not just at AAC&U, I think across higher education, but in many ways, the discussions and conversations around LERs have me the most excited that we might actually make progress on advancing those conversations. And I think advancing them in a way where we're talking about all those things together, not just the experiences over here, not just the skills over there, but really talking about how experiences are crucial for developing those skills and abilities and how that transparency is also being translated as well.
Mm. And I guess that also starts to hint at the why, not just for your own personal interest, but also AAC and you. When I think about, ACNU being involved in, innovative practices, equitable practices that, a lot of LERs, speak to your why just as an organization. So maybe, but in your own words, you could share where and why ACNU sees it as a really important as an organization to be showing up in this
Yeah.
space.
I mean, the mission AACNU has been around since 1915. We're one of the oldest associations out there, and we're a little different in the landscape of higher ed associations because we don't serve a single sector and we don't serve a single stakeholder. So, and that is because what we would argue is that what brings our membership together and what brings our institutional membership to be part of what AACNU does is because we're united by an idea. And that idea is that all students should have access to a liberal education. And that is an education that is inclusive of the liberal arts, but also goes beyond the liberal arts. So it's effectively a philosophy of education that says that all students should have access to an education that frees the mind. That is what
Mm.
the root of liberal is. It is liberation. It is to free. That is the Latin root is libere, which is to free. So it so in that sense, we are as an association on board with the ways in which we can deliver that education in increasingly new and meaningful and modern ways that embrace that idea of helping students seek their purpose, helping them to find their voice, helping them to think their own ideas, to put ideas together, right? That level of integrative thinking and thinking across disciplines, all of that is at the core of our mission and what we do. And I think I just said we don't serve a single stakeholder, and that's true, but we do work very, I would say, largely and squarely, at least, in the curricular space. We work a lot with academic affairs, right? We do a lot with general education. and then how we translate and connect general education to the majors. So we are always kind of starting in many ways within academic affairs. And I think we've gotten much better as an association about really recognizing and supporting the ways in which that learning extends into the co-curriculum and how we combine all that, right? Again, the huge benefit of how we think about what LERs can do for us is really hold the entirety of that learning together. But at its kind of core, I will say that a colleague once said to me many, many years ago, nothing lasting happens at a university without faculty.
Mm.
And there's something that was provocative and sobering about the comment. And whether you disagree with it or not, I think there's part of us that we all, there's a kernel of truth in just how important it is to not just have these elements of progress and modernity and innovation that are happening outside the curriculum. That we know that there is something powerful and transformative and frankly credible for students when they happen inside the curriculum. So I feel like part of our role within the LER Accelerator is helping to provide that piece of that faculty lens, curricular design lens. How do we make those translations with the things that faculty care about, the kind of stuff that's already in their courses, and how do we elevate that and try to build these connections to something like an LER?
Well, and you talk about that connection piece of some of the things that, are happen that faculty are doing inside of their classes that, align so much with what people, you know, talk about when they're, in the same breath as AAC, when they're talking about experiential learning, when they're talking about reflection, when they're talking about these things that lead to, I know you oversee work in an office of public purpose and opportunity. When, we talk about what about the liberal arts education prepares people for opportunity after college, a lot of that is stuff that doesn't right now show up on a transcript but
Right.
is taking place in courses. And so when,
Sure.
is that kind of one of the opportunity spaces when, you look at your role in the space of this learning employment record, something that can kind of contain a more holistic, highlight reel of learning experiences that are formal learning records to make those
100. Yeah.
connections between that awesomeness that's there, but not being told in a way that's verifiable.
Absolutely. I mean, and you're making me think, as even as you said all of that perfectly, Noah, and I'm thinking back to really early, oh my gosh, well over a decade ago, that Helen Chen and Tom Black, at former leader at AACRAO, and early work on the comprehensive learner record with Stanford and AACRAO and funded by Lumina. CBEN, I think, was in that as well. That again, just or this feels like a new generation of that conversation, but it is exactly that. It is, how do we take, and Tom Black's famous quote about the transcript, that a transcript is a record of everything a student has forgotten. Just the right, and it is perfect. And so to take this cornerstone of how we articulate achievement, that is a document only wholly understood, not even across higher ed, but really only fundamentally at the institution that issues that transcript. And because it is a series of course labels and codes with grades, all of which help effectively hold very little meaning beyond the boundaries of that campus. So thinking about the ways in which we can innovate around the explicitness of the awesomeness is what it's all about. And again, kind of going back to this, like, the conversations we've been having, we've known for a long time that these are not new ingredients that faculty need to figure out how to put into their courses. They very much think that they are in those courses. They are just implicit. They are the implicit components. So I think that's why ultimately I get excited about something the way in which an LAR can help us think differently is because it's helping us to think differently about how to make the implicit explicit.
I almost also hear you kind of doing you know, holding a mirror up to what Tom said and saying, the LER is a record of what we want students to remember
Yeah,
in a way that's verifiable, and trusted because it's coming from the university.
exactly. And I think what also gets me excited about the at least what how I have been helped to perceive what an LER is that this is also something the student holds, right? This is the student's record of their journey. So it feels in that way less less owned by the institution and far more owned by the individual student as a holder of their journey, their experiences, their opportunity to curate what that looks like, and to be able to craft that into what is a much better narrative, holistic narrative of what they've actually achieved.
Mm. Yeah, and totally probably an imperfect analogy, but my brain is going to like your car and
Hmm.
your loan documents are stuff that are all about you, but not stuff you ever look at again and or use unless somebody's
Hmm.
asking for them. But like your Carfax tells its whole history of your oil changes, your tire
Yeah.
rotations, your like literal scratches, and what you and your vehicle have done together in a way that people can
Hmm.
trust, not just take my word for it.
Exactly, exactly. And the trusted nature of it, I think, is its own layer of opportunity, frankly. And I don't want to be too Pollyannish in our time together, but I do tend to see more opportunity than not. We need all the opportunity we can get right now in higher ed, and I think that layer, because it's a layer that right now we have validation that's coming effectively only through an individual faculty member issuing a grade, and then maybe an overall institutional validation of graduation requirements, right? They're going into a transcript. But when I think about the conversations that we're having around validation on LERs and for those kinds of skills, and then ultimately how that LER gets put together, I see opportunities that both incorporate the institution, but also in close partnership with employers, um, in close partnership with community partners, might also be employers, of at least a more expansive viewpoint of who those employers are, municipal partners, community partners, for-profit partners. Um, and and now I think students then have a much fuller representation of why they are trusted,
Mm.
to be hired with these kinds of skills and credentials and skill experiences, because it's not just the institution anymore that's saying, hey, this is somebody who's really achieved something valuable. There also might be this opportunity to pull in external validators as well.
Wow. Well, I mean, from Trojan horse to Pollyanna, I don't think it gets more liberal arts than the conversation with Dr. Ashley Finley. Again, she's Vice President
Pleasure.
for Research and Senior Advisor to the President for AACNU, American Association of Colleges and Universities. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Credential Chats.
Thank you, Noah. Great to be with you.
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody, for sharing the valuable currency of your time and engagement with us here on Credential Chats. Until next episode, have a badge worthy week, everybody. So long.